I always think there's got to be caution, because there's a lot of things that can look like ADHD to the untrained eye, or even to the trained eye. Like, it's one of those things that, first and foremost, ADHD is a lifelong pattern. You're looking at something over a long course of your life, not likely to something stuck to my eyelid, something that's just cropped up like in the last couple of months, let's say. But I'll speak to that a bit more. But in terms of the dovetailing all the things that it could be. So for me, I'm kind of interested in those conversations around, how do you know this is not parental burnout or some other sort of burnout from the pandemic? How do you know it's not a trauma response? How do you know it's not because we're living in times with lack of attention and lack of focus? A really good book to read, if you haven't read or listened to the audio book, because I quite like listening to his voice, is Johann Hari's Stolen Focus. It says so much of what I've already known and already suspected, but just put together in a, like, again, I've used this analogy so many times, but it's so helpful. You know, when the flower's not blooming, you don't blame the flower, you look at the environment that it's in. So we can't really have these conversations about individually diagnosing individuals with a disorder and pathologizing without looking at the culture that we're currently in. And we are currently in a culture that is fast, that values business, that values working and being awake and using light for a lot longer than our ancestors used to. And yeah, across the board, people are talking about not being able to focus. So there's that. But then, on the other hand, ADHD is a real thing, and it's very common, and it doesn't traditionally get diagnosed in adults all that much. And there's reasons for that I'll talk about as well. So I think I wanted to add my 2 cents, I suppose, for some perspective on, like, how do you navigate your way through this? So this is obviously not a, like, let's talk through whether you've got a diagnosis or not. That's up to you and your own team of, and you do need a team. You really need a team of people, multiple people. Like with anything, if you're going to slap that diagnosis on yourself, and it's going to be the best thing for you and your brain and your family and work and everything, and feel good, like feel this is a relief. This is, I feel seen, I feel supported, and not just a pathologizing part of you that doesn't really explain it. You need multiple people. You need multiple sources to corroborate what's been going on for you. That's a whole separate thing in itself. But I guess for people who are sitting and wondering and wanting to have, thinking about it, have reflection on it without feeling one way or the other about it. I'm not anti-medication, but I'm not necessarily pro quick sloppy diagnostics, shall we say. I'm not a specialist in ADHD by any means. I have had the most experience in it in a 2-pronged way. So one is with children, assessing and treating and working with children, along with pediatricians and psychiatrists. They're the people who prescribe the medication, not me. But that's a kind of really dot by dot, can be tiered system. Okay, this is what we look for. These are the measures that we use, blah, 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 get to one point. The other tier has been seeing it mostly in adults in the criminal justice system, where it tends to become kind of obvious that this has been a history, a pattern throughout somebody's life, and then it's either been mismanaged, misdiagnosed, or not picked up at all. So remembering that for a lot of adults with ADHD, it's often not been the attention and the focus that's been the thing that's brought them to therapy. It's because they've gotten into certain patterns, not true for everybody, but true for a specific cluster. This is kind of more anecdotal. It's not in the book, but driving infringements, traffic accidents, impulsive things, constantly quitting jobs, like not being able to make relationships work, a pattern of potentially really struggling with depression and anxiety, or even being diagnosed with bipolar, or having conduct disorder as a young child, all sorts of things that you go, yeah, there is that, but it's a bigger part of something else. So if we kind of go back, let's start at the beginning. So what do I want to say about this? I guess where I've started noticing this has been actually in the entrepreneurial space. And it's uncanny. Like, there's different women that I know personally. There's different women whose courses I've done, whose books I've read, whose email lists I'm on. And I reckon I'm up to about, I was just saying 5 or 6, it's about 7 now. People who have come out and said, oh, I've had this ADHD diagnosis. It's been really validating. It's really explained things for me. And I'm like, is this a thing? Is this a thing? Women in their 30s and 40s all of a sudden coming out with ADHD? This is not a thing that I have been used to in my former clinical life. So it's interesting because on the one hand, it's like, really? Is this maybe better explained by pandemic, overwhelm, that kind of thing? Or is it really the case that having those extra stresses has brought it out for people to go, oh, actually, and this is the funny thing about ADHD, you can kind of cruise along with it to some extent. If you fit into certain systems, you know what's expected of you, and you can generally manage on the last minute rush. So for a lot of people with ADHD, stress propels action. I suspect that's why a lot of them make quite good entrepreneurs. And I've talked about in the podcast, which wasn't a video podcast, how in some ways as a pretty sure I'm not ADHD person because I'm the opposite to some of these other factors. We're all different. It's all just part of like enjoying the diversity, right? But I think about how some women in particular, I know, and men as well, manage to do these massive launches when you know they've just done it the night before, when they're able to just propel themselves and keep working and working and working and working and working and then crash. And I haven't been able to. So there are some articles, you can look them up. I encourage you to do some research if you're in that space, entrepreneurship and ADHD. Anecdotal, potentially, not necessarily like research Cochrane review papers, but I do think it's a thing. I think it's a thing because one of the gifts, if you would like to call it that, of ADHD is hyperfocus. Oh man, when you get these people under the pump and it is last minute to the wire, they produce some of the best work that the rest of us would like to be able to do, but I'm not built that way. I am the person, I've shared this story so many times before, but I am the person who had a friend at uni. I won't mention his name because he watches this, but I was always the person who got the unit handout, knew what assignment I was going to do, spent 3 weeks preparing for it, right? Did all the research, did the things. I do not like the last minute rush. I find it really stressful. I hate it. I like to plan in advance. I'm not built energetically. I'm not built. I'm not a last minute Larry. I'm a pre-planning Polly. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that. But anyway, so I would have done all the work. And then the night before, about the 10:30 at night mark, he would rock up. Oh, what's the assignment? What are we supposed to be doing? Here's the handout. Are you sure you're going to be able to do it? I was like, you haven't done any work yet. Oh, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. And he would just go home and he would work until 6, 7 in the next morning, getting his assignment back. Probably got the same mark or a better mark than me. Like, there are those people. So over time, need that adrenaline and that cortisol for performance. And it's a thing you see with people in sport, so many examples. But the hyper focus then can lead to burnout and crashing when your adrenals can't keep doing this. And I suspect for a lot of women in particular who are mums, the added stress of having kids and the fact that you kind of can't, to a certain extent, we all have that whole, I can't run a bath, I run my life. We all relate to that. But to a certain extent, it becomes overwhelming, like all the tasks that you have to do. They're hard enough anyway, but when you are someone who struggles with executive functioning, as in this part of your brain, like, where do I have to be? What time is that appointment? Just for yourself. And then you've got other small people and potentially a partner that you have to manage, and it's too much. I suspect this is where it's come out. The extra stress of having to do all the things, plus homeschooling, plus it's just made people go, there's something a bit more going on here for me. And so this is where we go back and we start having those conversations about Tell me about your childhood. Because you can't have a conversation about ADHD without doing the tell me about your childhood. You just have to. It is a neuro-developmental lifelong disorder that when I started my training was pretty much told this is a childhood disorder. You're supposed to grow out of it when you're 18. We now know that that research was debunked, and it was debunked because they gave child measures. I can't remember which one, probably the Connors, to adults. You don't give child measures to an adult. Makes no sense. So that research was debunked, but for a long time, like that was in the 90s. So that's like a good 20 years, I want to say, that has been sort of the unspoken mainstream thinking about it. Like you don't diagnose adults with ADHD. When I saw people in the criminal justice system, certainly I wasn't being encouraged or paid to assess people for ADHD. It's more like, yeah, look at their mood, look, personality disorders, those sorts of things. ADHD was often in the back of my mind, a part of this when you ask people about their childhood. How did you do at school? How did you manage the work? How did you go turning up on time? Did you find long periods where you just like couldn't focus and people accused you of not listening and not paying attention? Did you jump up and down on the desk? That's a cliche, but it's what people think of when they think of ADHD. We're going to get into the delineating different types, but historically, you have to go back and look at your childhood. It's not just the last few months that you've been not able to focus and struggling with attention. This is like your whole life. So primary school, maybe you can kind of coast through, particularly if you're female, particularly if you have what's called the inattentive type. So most adults, generally speaking, don't struggle so much with the impulsivity and don't struggle so much with the hyperactivity. Those are things that potentially you could, inverted commas, say people kind of grow out of, although sometimes not. You will know those people. Their age doesn't matter so much to their impulsivity and their hyperactivity. It's just a part of how they present, right? It's not necessarily a part of who they are, but it's a part of how they present. But for women, I guess we're now being more aware of people who have the type of ADHD where there isn't any hyperactivity and there isn't any impulsivity. These are girls typically who would have been called ditzy, daydreamers, sitting in the class, doodling in a notebook, looking out the window, twirling your hair, maybe talking too much to your friends. That can be part of it, but a big chunk of it is like, you look like you're listening. And more than you look like you're listening, you're not giving the teacher any grief, so you kind of get away with it. Even though you don't know what's going on and you haven't figured out what your homework is and what the assignment is, but you cruise through because you get it done the night before. Or maybe the night before you're like, oh, Mum, I haven't done this, help. And then you get it done and nobody knows any the wiser that you spent all night working on some project because you didn't know what you're supposed to be doing. Again, there's hyperfocus. When you're interested in something, you can focus on it for hours and hours and hours. As a child, you were probably told things like, if only you put so much focus into your schoolwork as you do to watching TV, going on ICQ. I don't know, whatever your thing was used for, like doing drawing, writing, making music, Tamagotchis. I don't know how old you are, so whatever the context was for where to be, you could hyper focus on. Yeah, of course, people with ADHD can focus when the brain is flooded with the feel-good hormones, with the dopamine. So without the dopamine, as in sit down and do 10 minutes of maths homework, brain is not lighting up. There's like very, very little joy in this area. So that's the thing. If you've been told, if only you could focus this hard on this instead of on this, that might be a sign. Like I said, the feeling like you just can't keep on top of things, appointments, half listening to people, zoning out. There's a history, I suppose, of people with ADHD potentially being accused of like just not listening, or maybe they've even gone and had their hearing tested because they just seem to not listen and they forget stuff all the time. And they start a task and then go off and do something else. So it might be as a child, yeah, you were told, go and get dressed, go and get your shoes on. And you kind of got halfway there, but then like you started looking at a comic book. You started playing with the dog. And you're like, huh? What am I supposed to be doing? that kind of stuff. And again, these are lifelong patterns, not necessarily things that just popped up in the last few months. Okay. So, as I said, you want to make sure that this is not better explained by other things. If you've got a history of sleep problems, now this is an interesting thing because, on the one hand, as clinicians, we kind of say historically kids with ADHD and ASD and a few other things are terrible sleepers. They don't settle well. They take a really long time to go to sleep. They give up naps really fast, potentially. They don't seem to need much sleep. So there's that part of the sleep thing, which can also be other things like bipolar disorder, whatever. But if you've got any history of sleep apnea, adenoid problems, any sort of medical things that are impacting your sleep, you've got to be really careful diagnosing ADHD. I wouldn't go diagnosing someone with ADHD if they had a medical problem related to their sleep, because you take a kid who doesn't sleep, they might seem tired and cranky, but they can also seem really chatty, really wired, and really hyperactive because they're not sleeping. So it can kind of go either way. So sleep is the thing to look at first. And that was the thing I would 100% rule out, identify before you go jumping on the, oh, that child looks hyperactive bandwagon. Sleep impacts every part of your brain. So poor sleep can be part of ADHD, but it doesn't explain it. So in terms of like, if you're sitting here thinking, this might reign true for me, is this something to think about? Like, yeah, it is. Like, just because ADHD is everywhere at the moment, it's like if you go on Audible or you go on Amazon or you go on the news, it's being mentioned everywhere. And that is for good reason. It's something like 4% of adults, give or take, who will have this. But we know that less than 1%-ish are diagnosed. Again, going back to the things to do with people aren't looking for ADHD in adults, or at least up until 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they definitely were not. It might be something we touched on in terms of like, was this part of your childhood? But again, that piece of research showing, which again was debunked, that people grow out of it. It's not true. So there's been a lot of noise about that. There's also been a history, I suppose, of concern about it being overdiagnosed. About 20 years ago, there was a lot of noise about, is this just potentially a way for drug companies to make more money? And that's not without warrant to look at, because definitely in the USA, the rates of kids being diagnosed with ADHD and being medicated was a lot higher potentially than it was in Australia and the UK, I want to say. So there is a history of overprescribing for sure. That needs to be taken into consideration. It needs to be considered a very valid point. Obviously, it causes parents concern when you're suggesting, how about you put your child on amphetamines? Dexamphetamines work when they work, and they are a lot better than they used to be, like I said. But the thing often that we talk about in the industry, I guess, is how do you know if someone's got ADHD? You give them the dexamphetamines, and if the dexamphetamines work and it lights up the right parts of the brain at the right time, then that's typically a sign that they've got it. If they haven't got it, it's not going to work. So you might have heard, I guess, there was a cultural kind of thing for a while there of like college kids in America taking dexamphetamines to improve their performance. Like, we have the research now that if you don't have ADHD, if you don't have an ADHD brain, dexamphetamines don't improve your performance. They actually make it worse. It's a serious thing. It's not necessarily something that if you did get a diagnosis of ADHD, that A, you would have to do. If you didn't want to, you always have a choice in healthcare, but also B, not necessarily something that you'd have to do daily. People go long periods of time on and off medication, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. That's a conversation to have with a psychiatrist or potentially a general practitioner. So what have we talked about in terms of typical patterns? Historically, yeah, crap sleep. So we'll be looking at that. School difficulties, like I said, getting through primary school, you might go under the radar. It's more high school where things get to be difficult, because kids are not going to put up their hand and say, I didn't hear what you said, I wasn't paying attention. So once you start getting less structure, like when you go to college, you've got to organize your own classes, you've got to organize your own homework, this is kind of where things start to get a bit tricky. So people with ADHD typically, they don't do homework, they don't do preparation. But if you know how to fit into the school system and you're smart and you know what you kind of need to do, you can get away with it. So like I said, it's only when your brain gets so overloaded, like potentially becoming a parent, getting less sleep, having more responsibilities, that is when you go, okay, I'm struggling to keep using that stress, cortisol, adrenaline response to get my shiz done. Okay. So I'm thinking this is where we're seeing this phenomenon kind of coming from. So isn't everyone a little bit ADHD? Oh, you'll hear this. It's a common response. I want to say, yeah, okay. Life is chaotic for most people. Most people struggle with focus. Most people struggle with attention, but there's extra stuff when you've got ADHD. This is not like something that you can just work your way around by buying a calendar and telling yourself to be more organized. It is a very real structural thing that happens in your brain, and it's been a lifelong pattern. Again, it didn't just pop up in the last couple of months. It's not just because you're a bit ditzy or you can't organize yourself or that you're a man child. Like, there are real symptoms, I suppose, here around the struggle to get your life in order, right? So it's not just that you can't manage the cleaning and the housework and running a job and having kids. It's like it becomes so overwhelming that you can't actually get your brain to figure out what it is you're supposed to do. So I think that's the important thing to think about, that again, this is something you've been struggling with your whole life. It hasn't just come out of nowhere. You definitely want to look for things like sleep issues, burnout, trauma. A traumatized child will behave a lot like a kid with ADHD in lots of different ways. So there's things to think about here, and I can't necessarily get into all the nuances, but I would say, like, things come and go in their popularity in mental health, for sure. ADHD is very much flavor of the month. We can acknowledge that and go, okay, yep, 2 years ago, everyone was talking about narcissism. Years before that, it was bipolar disorder, and a little bit more about how we're now sort of switching from what they used to call high functioning autism / Asperger's to now we're calling it like being neurodiverse or being on the spectrum, or, like, we have different conversations at different times. And this is good. It's good for people to be more aware about it. But I think if you're thinking about diagnosis, it's a complicated procedure. It's not just something you kind of go off on a whim to discover. You'd want to be pretty sure that this is impacting your life, impacting your work, impacting your relationships, impacting the way that you feel about yourself. If it's just a passing fancy, it's probably not ADHD, right? Supposedly something else going on. So it's different in different countries. Generally speaking, the process here in Australia would be for an adult. Again, you could go off and see a clinical psychologist who could diagnose you with it. But if you're talking getting a bigger, broader perspective, when we're talking medication, you need to see usually a psychiatrist, although there are changes in Australia happening here where you can go and see a GP and they might be able to diagnose it. For a child, again, it's usually an interplay between a psychologist who will do some observational stuff, help you with some educational stuff and behavioural planning, talk to school, talk to OTs, that kind of thing. But also usually there's a paediatrician or a psychiatrist involved, particularly if you're talking medication. You can't take medication in Australia without talking to someone who is a specialist in psychopharmacology. And that is typically going to be a psychiatrist or a paediatrician. And you've got multiple assessments. You don't want this to be something that someone meets you for 15 minutes and goes, yeah, there you go, you've got this neuro-developmental disorder. It's a lifelong thing. You want it to be a careful discussion, a reflective discussion, a really empathic discussion that has neither dismissiveness nor judgment nor gaslighting. Like, it's going to take some time. And if this is a position that you're in, I wish you all the best with it and that you get the information and support that you need. And if you've just been curious, hopefully this has answered some of those curious questions without it necessarily, as I said, being like a, I don't know, judgment column whether people have it or not. I don't know. I haven't met you. I just wanted to give you some pointers from my 2 cents with my clinical hat on, just for something different. So I'll talk to you in my next video, whenever that will be. Enjoy your day.